In this work with clients, I'm going to talk about the issue of self-disclosure. Um, Often in your training, you're advised against self-disclosure. It's not about you, it's about the client, and you got to maintain professional boundaries and so on. So you don't talk about yourself. Um, I don't need to say very much about it unless it's an issue. And how many of you found that that's a bit of an issue for you? It's an issue for you in your work. Okay, some of you have. So I don't have much to say about it except this. I'm a full believer in self-disclosure. Um, Precisely because of what I said about the compassion of recognition. The more the client gets that you're no different from they are, the more they're comfortable they're going to feel. Because don't be afraid that they're going to think you're so screwed up you can't help them. Oh my God, how can you help me if you know this? You know, no, they actually appreciate the contact and the sense that their experience is shared. And again, for all the difference, for all the significant difference between myself and my clients, they were living in the streets with HIV. I was living in a beautiful home with the mortgage paid off, and so on. And my shopping addiction did not give me hepatitis C, nor could I overdose on it. Um, and one of the criticisms of the book I've written, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, about addiction, when some people criticize it, it's, oh, we have to read pages and pages about his music, shopping addiction, and he actually thinks it's the same as his clients. The interesting thing is, my heroin addicted, HIV infected clients never thought there was anything weird about it when I talked to them about it. They said, hey, yeah, doc, you're just like the rest of us, aren't you? They get it. They got it. They got it. The people who don't get it are the people who are in denial of their own addictions, that's all. But when is self-disclosure appropriate and when it's not appropriate? What I'm saying is that we don't need boundaries. Formally speaking, when we trust ourselves and when we're clear. So, you know, boundaries between countries are only there to let some things in and some things not in, keep some things out, right? That's the only thing you need boundaries. When there's no fear around anything, there's no need for boundaries. So boundaries always reflect some kind of fear, whether in politics or in personal life. So when is it appropriate to share? When it's for the benefit of the client. When it's to move their therapeutic or healing process forward, then it's more than appropriate to share, to self-disclose. When the self-disclosure is necessary so that you can be understood by the client, or because you want their empathy, or because you just want to impress them with how honest you are, then it's not appropriate. Because in all of those latter cases, you're using the client for your own benefit. That's not appropriate. Being used for somebody else's benefit is what got them into your office in the first place. That's what happened to them as children. When you in any way use them to your own benefit, to enhance yourself or make yourself feel better or anything at all, on some level they're going to sense that and not trust it. And the same is self-disclosure. So that you self-disclose when you know that it's going to enhance the therapeutic process or the healing dynamic, and you don't when the motive is more self-directed. That's all. That's my view on self-disclosure. Now, any questions on that whatsoever? Is that clear enough? Yes?
Well, I was just thinking about I'm terrible with names. Our friend over here who came up there and
Raphael?
yes,
Okay.
had trouble asking for help. And then what brought to mind was Aaron's client who slept through an appointment. And I think sometimes
Can you hold the mic a bit closer?
we overextend ourselves, or we have trouble because we have clients who are so accustomed to not receiving help and don't know that, how to ask for help. And that's when we can get ourselves into sticky situations by like,
So you think that you overextend yourself because you see that the client doesn't know how to ask for help. Is that right?
I'm not sure that.
That's what you said.
Yeah, sure. I think us in the helping professions can do that.
Are you willing to come up here? What's your name?
Megan.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Okay, have a seat. So if I just want to make sure I understand you right, okay?
Yeah.
So you're thinking of Raphael who has trouble asking for help, and you're thinking that we have these clients who really have trouble asking for help. And so that causes us to overextend ourselves and kind of, is that what you meant?
Not really. I'm not really thinking of specific clients. I'm thinking about general population.
That's okay.
Yeah.
But is that what you meant?
Yes. Yeah. Like, let me help you.
Yeah.
And
Okay. Yeah. And let me take responsibility for your inability to ask for help.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. And you think you're doing that because of the client.
I mean, I get where you're
That-
going.
Okay. Where am I going?
That it's the story I'm telling myself. Oh, those people, they don't know how to ask for help. I better, for my own sense of,
Well, what story are you telling about yourself?
I guess, okay, yeah, I think what I tend to hold back. I think that's my own
So you don't ask for
early,
help either.
right, exactly, yeah, and so I question whether I'm not extending myself when I should be, because I have a lack of self-worth, and so I'm not trying hard enough. But it's like this, like, inner debate in my head.
I think you know, if I understand you right, just see if this resonates with you.
Mm-hmm.
I think you know how much pain and isolation and suffering there is in not being able to ask for help.
Yes.
And you want to rescue those clients from that experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or even like push them along the path
Yeah, you
to
want
get to the point where they're ready to
you-
ask for help.
Yeah. Well, who do you think you're trying to push?
Yeah. And like
Who do you think you're trying to push?
past me,
Not past you.
current me.
I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think it's like the ghost that I carry alongside me.
So there's some part of you
Yeah.
that's like that.
Yes.
Okay? Fair enough. And how do you feel when you perceive them as not being able to ask for help? What feeling do you get inside?
Like anxiety and panic and
Anxiety and panic.
Yeah.
Okay. So you think, Megan, that you're extending yourself because you really want to help the client, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are you really trying to help?
myself.
You just don't want to feel anxious and panicky.
Yes.
So you're using them,
Right. Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
They didn't come to you to be used by you, to feel better about yourself.
Well, okay, so that's my question. The
Yeah.
people that don't even come to the doorstep.
Well, you can't help them, can you?
No.
What about them?
I feel anxiety and panic.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Then you're in a hard...
Yeah.
I tell you, if your problem is that people who need help are not asking for it, in the United States right now, you're in a lot of trouble, okay? At the
Yeah.
highest political levels I'm talking about,
Right.
okay? But let's just come back to you though.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? That anxiety and panic is yours.
Yes.
And you're reaching out to help them is not to help them. It's so that you don't have to feel the anxiety and the panic.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And can I ask you, where does that anxiety and panic dwell in you? Like where in your body can you locate it?
Well, right now my heart's racing because I'm like up in fear in front of
Yeah,
people,
no, but
it's mostly down in
mostly
my...
down here, okay. And how familiar is that feeling to you?
It's like it's one of those formative feelings that I don't feel on a day-to-day basis now, but I felt a lot when I was younger.
So it's very early, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So that's what's still showing up.
Right.
Okay, that means that when that's showing up and you're letting it guide your behavior,
Hmm.
you're not the adult therapist.
Right.
You're a child desperate for help.
Yeah.
Okay, now from that place, do you think you're going to be very effective with the client?
No.
What is your actual intention for the client? What is your intention for yourself, by the way? This part of you that's anxious and panicky, what would be your intention for yourself?
For myself,
Yeah, in relation to this part.
to receive healing, or
What is your intention for yourself?
for myself,
How would you want to relate to this part of you?
oh, with compassion and
Understanding.
understanding and love.
Yeah,
Hmm.
right.
Yeah.
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 But not a demand that it should be different.
No.
Okay.
No.
All right.
That's actually what you just said is really helpful, the demand that it should be different. Because I kind of think about like what you said, I'm in trouble in our country right now if I
Yeah.
want. But, there are such like generational trauma and cultural genocide and ongoing oppression. And so I think it's like not wanting to sit with the pain of that and
Yeah.
having this demand that it
Yeah.
instinctual it to be different and want to fix it instead
Right.
of just,
And so you're trying to fix that in other people,
yeah,
okay?
yeah,
Rather than just being with them and holding
yeah,
it. Can you see that?
yes, yeah.
Okay. So it's not because of them,
Right,
it's because of you.
yeah,
Okay. And if you could recall again that quote from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, whatever you do, don't run away from your pain. Okay? So when that comes up for you, be with it and get some help with it.
hmm,
But don't try and rescue the client so that you can be rescued.
yeah,
Because what you want for them is precisely what you just offered yourself. You want them to develop that self-compassion and that self-understanding.
yeah,
And you keep rescuing them, you're robbing them of the opportunity. You get that?
yes,
Okay?
yes,
Thank you.
yes.
All
Thank
right.
you.
You're welcome. I'll just close by emphasizing again, and I think we've demonstrated this amply with the help of the courageous people that came up to the front here, that the most important work you do in this field of helping others is the work that you do with yourself. And rest assured that when anything is difficult, the source of that difficulty is you. And rest assured that when you're not feeling compassion, there's something it's not that you're not compassionate, it's that something is blocking your compassion, some issues, some pain that you have that you haven't resolved. So be very compassionately curious towards yourself. What is blocking my compassion? Which then brings me to my last point, which is about judgments. I said that we need to offer these people unconditional positive regard, non-judgmental, unconditional acceptance. Now the fact is, that's nice to say, but is anybody here who's never had a judgment about any client? No hands? Yeah, because I'm certainly, I couldn't raise my hand. So what do we do with that? Well, what we do with it is that we get curious about ourselves. Because the judgments that we make are always about ourselves. There's always some part of us that may behave differently than the client, but the dynamic is the same. So now, but by judgment, I don't mean an opinion. An opinion that a person is behaving narcissistically is just an opinion. It might be completely valid. And then you be curious, what kept them stuck in that phase of narcissism in childhood? So there's nothing wrong with the opinion. When I talk about judgment, I'm not talking about an opinion. I'm talking about an opinion that's associated with a negative feeling towards the individual about whom you have that opinion. That's what a judgment is. Now that kind of judgment, whenever you have a negative feeling associated with an opinion, that's always about ourselves, in every case. And then it's a great way to get to know ourselves. So don't judge yourself for having judgments. Because you're not doing the judgments. It's not that you decided to sit down and say, I'm going to be judgmental right now. The judgments arise automatically from our unconscious. The emotional feeling associated with the opinion arises from our unconscious. And that's good, because now we can look at it. And then you can ask yourself, oh, okay, what do I believe about myself that I don't like? And how can I work with that part to get to understand it and have compassion for it? So judgments are great as long as you don't believe them, as long as you use them to get to know yourself. In fact, they're wonderful guides to ourselves. So again, the message is you just approach everything with compassion and curiosity, including your own stuff. Again, the prevalent model in our society is the belief, whether it's consciously held or implicit, is that addiction is a choice that people make. And that is the view that dominates the legal approach to addiction. People are addicted because, and then they commit illegal acts because they choose to do so in order to feed the addiction. And this is all a matter of choice. Now, of course, if people are choosing to do socially disapproved things, then we just have to enforce some consequences on them so they'll stop doing it, and to deter others from behaving in the same way. So this is the addiction as choice model. And there's even a book called, by a psychologist at Harvard, called Addiction, a Disease of Choice. And I haven't read it, I just have no patience for that nonsense. But I think he's arguing that because people can recover from it, therefore they're choosing to be that way. I'm not sure if I'm being fair to him. He might be more, I hope he's more sophisticated than that. But the very title is enough to tell me that I'm not interested in it. Because I've never met anybody who chooses to be an addict, or for that matter, chooses consciously to stay that way. I think the compulsions happen on a much deeper level. Nevertheless, that view dominates society, and the reason your country has more people in jail per capita by far than any other nation on earth is because of this belief that addictions and related behaviors are matters of choice. That also implies that prevention necessitates information so that people can make more intelligent choices. So your Attorney General, I should say your recently fired Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, gave a speech, I think 2 years ago, where he said that in the 80s and the 90s, there used to be programs that emphasized prevention, and we can do that again. And we can tell people, don't do it, drugs are bad for you. And we can tell people that drug use leads to criminality, and we can help people make better choices. I'm paraphrasing him very accurately. He was, of course, referring to the Nancy Reagan-inspired campaign, Just Say No. This is the idea of prevention, telling people drugs are bad, don't choose them, billboards, programs, just say no. Of course, what's interesting is that there's absolutely no evidence for such a perspective. And not only is there no evidence for it, there's every evidence against it, as shown by the fact that in your country right now, every 3 weeks, as many people die of drug overdoses as died in 9/11, on that day in 9/11. So every 3 weeks you got a 9/11 in this country due to drug overdoses. He's hearkening back to these prevention programs. That's how successful they were. So this is how bankrupt the political discourse is around addiction. That they're citing a completely useless, unsuccessful, and I would say harmful campaign, which fails so desperately that right now the life expectancy of the white middle class is decreasing because of it. it never bothered us very much when the life expectancy of black people or native Indian people were decreasing, but now that's the white middle class, now we have a problem. And despite that colossal, I would say worse than failure, but colossal negative impact of that kind of understanding, he's still advocating. And of course, his solution was to toughen up the drug laws and to make drug-related activities even more prohibitively inviting of punishment. I won't spend any more time on that particular view. It's not worth actually dwelling on. But it's the dominant view in this society. And of course, it leads to a lot of stigma, and a lot of ostracization, a lot of judgment, and so on, which themselves are harmful, as you will see. So it's not that it's just a bad idea that's neutral. Even if it wasn't accompanied by harsh drug laws, so that there are literally people in jail for decades in this country who were caught 3 times using a substance or possessing a substance that has now become legal in several states and has now become legalized in Canada, cannabis. And so people are in jail for decades, 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing. So even if we remove that particular consideration, even if the harm wasn't only the incarceration of people that have no business being in jail, if we just took the attitude itself, get rid of the laws, just if you took the attitude that people are choosing it and therefore they're derelicts or people with poor willpower or stupid, that alone would be harmful. Just the attitude itself would be harmful. So the choice model, even if you could avoid its legal implications, would still be harmful for reasons that I think ought to be clear fairly soon. So that's all I'm going to say about it. Put it aside for now. Now, the dominant view in the medical world is that addictions represent a primary disorder of the brain. The American Academy, or the American Society of Addiction Medicine, calls it a primary disorder of the brain, and NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, again calls it a brain disorder. So it's the disease model, it's a brain disease model. Now more recently, Dr. Nora Volkov, the head of NIDA, who's done a lot of research on the addicted brain, has kind of tempered her disease model with acknowledging the value of a biopsychosocial perspective, an environmental perspective, a developmental perspective, but she hasn't really budged from the idea that it's primarily a brain disease. And it would be nice if her view was compatible with a broader point of view, but actually I think it's lip service. In practice it's not that compatible at all. So if you believe in the disease model, you have a certain point of view. And there was a very interesting article in the New England Journal of Medicine just a couple of months ago. Somebody actually quotes my work in addiction in the New England Journal. Mark Lewis, who's a neuropsychologist who has written a couple of books on addiction, and this article is on addiction as a learning developmental problem. And he points out in this article that the disease model is just not compatible with this learning developmental model because it assumes that the patient has a disease that you, as the medical doctor or clinician of some kind, is going to help mitigate or try to cure, but that the person fundamentally is lifelong doomed to have this disease, at least in the background. So it's a disease that the person has. There's a thing called a disease and the person has it, which is very similar to the medical view of all conditions, such as multiple sclerosis. We assume there's such a thing as multiple sclerosis that a person has. So there's an entity. So certainly, if you have pneumonia, and that because of infection of your lungs with bacteria, then there's the bacteria that invades your lungs and then causes disease. And the way to deal with it is to get rid of the bacteria. And that it works in that particular case. Thank God it works. It gets a bit more subtle and a bit more complex when you get to chronic illnesses that do not have external causes that you can get rid of. So something like multiple sclerosis is assumed to arise in the body as kind of an independent entity that's got its own activity. And so it's separate from the person somehow, but it invades the person, or even if it arises from within. In the case of multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, other diseases, it's an condition in which the immune system arises against the body that it's meant to protect and instead attacks the body and therefore causes illness. And naturally we say that we don't know what causes most autoimmune diseases. A different view would actually have it that the disease doesn't arise accidentally. It arises because of the person's life. That there's something about the person's life that potentiated that particular illness. And that's my view of most chronic illness. Not all chronic illness. Some is genetic, inherited, very few, very rare, but it does exist. But for the most part, most malignancies, most autoimmune diseases don't have a strong genetic component. And even where they do, the genetic component is not absolutely determinant. So if you take something like breast cancer, out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 5 or 7 will have the breast cancer gene. 95, 93 will not. And even in the case of all the women who do have the gene, not all of them will get the disease. They certainly have an increased risk, but it doesn't mean they get the disease. So Angela Jolie very famously had her ovaries removed. I think she had also mastectomies a few years ago because her aunt died of ovarian or breast cancer, and so did her mom, I think. So she was at risk, and she decided to deal with it by removing the organs that could possibly be affected. And, you know, that's not an unreasonable thing to do because there was a high risk there. But even then, it's not the case that having the gene guarantees that you're going to have the illness. In fact, in many cases you will not, which means there must be other factors. So the disease model has this entity or this process that somehow takes over your body, but it's not somehow expressive of your life. And that's the same, much the same model of addiction. It's got this disease, this primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain. And if you ask why, well, they say about 40 to 70%. This is according to the previous Surgeon General of the United States, who issued a report, quite a positive report in many ways, on addiction a couple of years ago, that as far as I know, sank without a trace. He was hoping that it would do for addiction what the previous general's report did for smoking. And I don't think it's had anything like that kind of an effect. In fact, I don't think most people even know about it. But nevertheless, in this model, he argued that, or he cited the evidence that addiction is about 40 to 70% genetically determined. So that's the disease model, and it has a much stronger relationship to reality than the choice model, but that doesn't make it either accurate or appropriate. It's just a model that explains some things a whole lot better than the choice model does, but it does not account for the phenomenon of addiction. So that's the second point of view. And again, from the therapeutic level, it invites a kind of relationship where you're the expert who's going to cure that disease in that person. Now, what I'll be putting forward is what can be called a developmental model. It's sometimes called the developmental learning model because the brain learns to behave in certain ways, but that's fair enough. The more you do something, the more you develop pathways in the brain. They're going to keep doing the same thing. So how do you learn to play the piano? Well, you practice. And at a certain point, you no longer have to think as to what key to hit with your digits, because your brain is doing it automatically. At this point, what that means is that new brain circuits have developed that automatically do this. And so the brain has learned something. So that's the learning model. And sure enough, in addiction, if you do something often enough, the brain will find it that much easier to do it again and again and again. But I'm much more interested in the developmental part of it, for two reasons. One is that, in the first place, I think it's more accurate. I mean, in fact, it is accurate, number one. And number two, if it's developmental, then, and knowing that human beings can develop even later on in life, then the question becomes not how to teach them new behaviors, although that's a part of it for sure, but how to develop in different ways. And again, if something is developmental, then the key question becomes, and even if you think it's a learning problem, the question still is, under what conditions do people learn? So that the developmental model is much more concerned with the conditions under which the problem developed in the first place, and then secondarily in the conditions that it takes to promote new, healthier kind of development. So that's, to me, is the value of the developmental model. I also think it happens to be scientifically and psychologically accurate. At which point I want to say something about knowing. We talk a lot these days about the knowledge revolution and the information revolution. And we confuse knowledge with knowing. You can have a lot of knowledge without knowing anything. Because knowing isn't a bank of data that you've retained in your brain. That's knowledge. Knowing isn't information that you've stored. That's knowledge. Knowing is the ability to know, to see something in its complexity, in its wholeness. It's not bits of data. It's actually an approach and an ability to see the large picture and to see how things fit together. And the intellect is not sufficient for that kind of knowing. The intellect can have knowledge, but for knowing, you need other faculties. And in the Western world, and certainly in North America, we really emphasize knowledge. We don't pay a whole lot of attention to knowing. Now, one way of knowing is through the gut. You just know. That doesn't give you any kind of a Bachelor of Arts or a PhD. You just know. And I'm sure that in your work, you've had the experience that you just knew something that was quite contrary to the knowledge that was being presented to you. You just knew. You felt it to be true. And that kind of knowing comes from both the gut and the heart interacting with the brain. So it's the connection of those three parts of ourselves. And both the gut and the heart have nervous systems that are connected to the apex of the central nervous system, which is the brain. And there's no real knowing unless those three are connected. And when we go to school, these two parts are not only not encouraged, they're actually ignored and even dismissed. And this is exalted as the apex of intelligence and ability. So we have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge who don't know anything. And I'm always reminded of the Wizard of Oz. At the end of the film, you know, the scarecrow who's been looking for a brain all the time. Does anyone remember what the wizard actually says to him about that? It's a beautiful satire. To me, it's the high point of the film. Well, the wizard says to the scarecrow, "You've been looking for a brain. But there's a lot of people out there who are experts and give lectures and write books and are professors who have no more brains than you do. What they have that you don't have is a diploma. You don't need a brain, you need a diploma." And it gives them a diploma. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of knowledge who just don't know very much. And I'm also reminded of a story that's possibly apocryphal, which means it may or may not have happened, about Timothy Leary, who was the LSD guru. And bless his soul, he did interesting work. He also, I think, caused a lot of damage. But that's another story because of his own dysfunctions. But apparently there's a story that he had this idea of tune in, turn on, drop out, and LSD being the pathway to universal love and infinite knowledge. And the story goes, as I heard it, is that he's speaking to a group of academics about LSD and knowledge and all this. And when he finishes the talk, and I've seen this myself actually, when I've spoken to certain groups, this academic stands up and asks this long, convoluted question. It's a very complex question. And Leary says, all that he saw was a skull going, "Love me, love me, love me." In other words, knowledge is very often used as a compensation for an insufficient sense of self. So let's not put all our faith in knowledge. Let's put our faith in knowing, which includes knowledge, but is more than that. And I say this particularly for those of you who are, as we identified earlier in the day, in situations where your own intuitions and awareness and insights are not compatible with the dominant ethic and ideology and approach of the organizations, institutions, and hospitals and so on that you may be working for. And that can create not just grinding tension, but also a lot of self-doubt. Because who am I to challenge, I'm just telling you, trust yourselves. Examine yourself. Is this in my gut, in my heart? Do I know this? And does that line up with my intellectual understanding of things? And if it does, never mind what anybody else is saying. Just trust yourself. And by the way, it's the same self-trust that we want to promote in our clients as well. So having said that then, what is the view of addiction that I think makes sense? So I've already identified addictions for you. I'll quickly repeat that definition. It's a complex physiological and psychological, emotional and spiritual process, yes, that manifests in any behavior that a person craves because it gives temporary pleasure or relief, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of, and cannot give up despite negative consequences, may even be in denial of it. Those negative consequences could be on yourself, or it could be on others, or both. Now, again, it's craving relief, pleasure in the short term, harm in the long term, inability or refusal to give it up. That's what an addiction is. And of course, you'll note that I said nothing about substances per se. It's not about drugs. Usually when we talk about addictions and addicts, we're talking about drugs. But clearly it includes a whole lot of other behaviors. And this is one of the things that's wrong with the disease model. It doesn't account for these other behaviors because it's all about what the drugs do to the brain. But what about the addictions that don't involve drugs, such as eating, such as gambling, such as sexual pursuits, such as pornography, such as the internet, such as the World Health Organization has determined recently what they call internet gaming disorder? How about work? How about television? In other words, anything. Well, none of those involves any drugs. So the definition of addiction is not restricted to drugs, it includes drugs. It includes substances of any kind, but it's not restricted to them. So that's clear, which is one reason alone why the disease model is obviously inadequate. Because if addiction is a disease induced by the contact of the brain with the drug, what about all these other behaviors? So you all recognized that sometime in your life you had some kind of an addictive pattern, whether related to substances or to behaviors. So the question I'm going to ask you now is not what you were addicted to or when or for what duration, but simply what did you like about it? What did it do for you in the short term? So that amongst those of you that weren't here yesterday, if you're just willing to tell me, just put your hand up. What did it give you in the short term that you appreciated and wanted? Just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. And again, you don't have to tell us anything about what you were addicted to. Okay? Thank you.
Makes me brain dead. I don't feel there's nothing to notice anymore.
I'm just sorry, I just didn't quite hear you. Can you say it again?
It made me brain dead.
Brain dead, you said?
Yeah, that I don't notice things anymore.
Okay, so it kind of dulled you, so you wouldn't be so aware of things. Is that right? Okay, let me ask you, what did you like about that?
I guess not having to feel.
You wouldn't feel stuff, is that right?
Yeah,
Because the feelings were too painful.
yeah,
Okay, in other words, it was a pain relief.
yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, just passing time, just not
Right.
feeling.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Somebody else. Okay, in the front here.
Hi, thank you. My addiction gave me comfort and social connection.
Comfort and social connection. So pain relief, dull, negative feelings, and so comfort and social connection. Thank you. Somebody else. Thank you.
So my addiction gave me euphoria.
Euphoria. So a sense of well-being and heightened states of pleasure. Okay. Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more. Yeah. Oh, okay. Sure.
Yeah. So the substances that I was addicted to provided me kind of like I like to call it like a veil. So it allowed me to present myself in social situations and interact with people in ways that I was never able to before.
And what did that enable you to do? That enable you to be in contact with people. Is that right? Okay, great. So again, it's a question of social acceptance and presentability and connection, right? Okay, thank you. All right, let's take one more. There was a hand at the back there. Let's go ahead.
They took away my fear.
Took away your fear. Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, let's look at all these things. And I'm not sure I'll remember everything people said, but dulling of difficult states, pain relief, comfort, the mitigation of fear, social confidence, social connection. Do you notice that these are very pleasurable, very desirable states that we all want, in fact, even need? As I said, we're creatures of connection. In other words, the addiction can't be said to be a primary disorder when it's not the primary problem. The primary problem is that of lack of social connection, which is to say of isolation. The primary problem is mind states and emotional states that are unbearable, so we have to dull them. The primary problem of pain that we have to escape from. The primary problem is lack of sufficient pleasure in this life. These are the primary problems. And the addiction just comes along as an attempt to solve these problems. Now, by definition, it's the nature of addiction that it's a temporary solution, but a long-term blight. So, and that's clear. That's why we're talking about it. If there was no long-term problem, we would just all be happily addicted. So that's obvious. But what's less obvious is their role as actually adaptations to some inner discomfort. So really what it is it's an attempt to regulate your inner states by means of some external behavior or external substance. So there's a problem of self-regulation where you don't have pleasure and you can't get to it, where you don't have comfort and you can't get to it, where you have isolation and you can't break out of it. So it's an inner state that then you use some external remedy to attempt to fix. That's what an addiction is. Well, as soon as you recognize that, we see that it's not a genetic problem. You were not born without the capacity to experience pleasure. You were not born without the capacity to have human contact. You might say highly autistic infants may be like that, and then you have to wonder what happened there. But for the most part, nobody's born, and we're born for social connection. We're wired for it. We're wired for attachment, actually. As I said earlier, we're wired for relationship. And pleasure is obviously a normal part of the human range of experiences. And the question becomes, why on God's green earth, with all that nature and human invention and culture can offer, did you lack a capacity to experience a heightened state of pleasure? And why did you need that so much? Now are we looking at examining people's lives, not just the biology of their brains, but their actual lives. So on the first level then, addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. And it doesn't matter how you put it, whether it's isolation, uncomfortable states, ahedonia or anhedonia or lack of pleasure. These are all forms of emotional pain. And hence, my particular mantra is that the first question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. So when you're working with clients, I really encourage you to find out what they get from it and to validate what they're looking for. Not, this is terrible for you. They already know that. That's why they're in your office. You want them to know that you get that what they're seeking is actually worth seeking. That what they value is worth valuing. And that want is very normal. They just actually want to feel like a normal human being. And then that opens an inquiry. How did you lose those capacities? And how can you regain them? What's in the way of you having them? But you begin by validation. So that's the first level on which I look at addictions. Now the second level has kind of a medical angle to it, and that has to do with self-medication. So very specific self-medication. Self-medication for specific mental health conditions. So, having been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, for a while I took stimulant medications, which elevate dopamine levels in the brain. And I'll talk about the importance of dopamine shortly. So I was given stimulants, and we use stimulants to treat ADHD, Ritalin, Dexedrine, Adderall, other drugs like that, which elevate the levels of this key brain chemical called dopamine. But of course, all the stimulants elevate dopamine levels, not just the pharmaceutically produced ones. So, what also elevates dopamine is crystal meth, and cocaine, and caffeine, and nicotine, which means that a lot of the people, probably about 30% of the people who are using stimulant drugs as their drug of so-called choice, but let's call it their drugs of compulsion, are actually self-medicating ADHD, which has been shown in studies as well. Which means if you're working with an addicted population, particularly with those with stimulant addiction, you might as well check them for ADHD, because it's very useful to identify that condition, because it can be helped. And that was the subject of my first book, called Scattered in the United States. Scattered. Now, ADHD is self-medicated also by alcohol, which calms the hyperactive brain, and also with cannabis, which does the same thing. People also self-medicate depression. So if you've ever taken an SSRI, a selective serotonin uptake inhibitor medication like Prozac or Celexa or Zoloft, these medications elevate the level of available serotonin in the synaptic cleft, in the gap between nerve cells. So there's more serotonin activity, which is helpful in mood regulation. By blocking the uptake of serotonin into the cell, it makes more available in that active space between the cells. That's how they work. Dopamine also blocks the uptake of serotonin. Therefore, people also use cocaine, which elevates dopamine levels, to self-medicate depression. People self-medicate anxiety with opiates, with cannabis, with alcohol, with tranquilizers. People self-medicate bipolar disorder with alcohol, which lifts the highs and lifts the lows and smooths down the highs of the bipolar fluctuative state. So a lot of people with bipolar disorder are actually self-medicating with alcohol. Social anxiety. Somebody once pointed out, if you believe you're inadequate in your social interactions, you put on this veil, as someone said, and now you're comfortable and confident in your social interactions. And since social interaction, contact, connection, attachment is so important, you can see why people would want to self-medicate that condition. And finally, and saliently, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a specific constellation of symptoms, which again, psychiatry considers to be a disease. I will tell you parenthetically, it's not a disease, it's actually a normal response to certain abnormal experiences. It's not a disease. But people self-medicate PTSD with opiates. So many of the veterans who returned from North America's crusades in the Middle East and elsewhere come back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they become addicted to opiates. So these are all forms of self-medications. So now we're looking at, again, sort of a multi-layer approach to addiction, looking at through like a kaleidoscope. You look at it this way, it looks this way, and then you shake it a bit. No, it looks like something else. So on one level, they're simply compensations for emotional pain. They're solutions to a problem. On a specific level, there are self-medications for certain mental health conditions. And now we can also look at now we can talk about the biology of it and the neurobiology of addiction. And the disease model of addiction says that it's a disease because the circuits of impulse regulation and incentive and motivation and emotional self-regulation are dysfunctional, so that's a brain disease. And it's true. In addicted people, all those circuits do lack healthy functioning. That's why people behave that way. Somebody mentioned fear regulation. Well, the job of the midfrontal cortex, the central frontal part of the cortex, one of their jobs is to mitigate fear, is to regulate fear. And so people in whom the midfrontal cortex is not so is attuned communication with other people. That's another job of the midfrontal cortex, attuned communication with other people. And certainly, as a therapist, attunement is part of the most important quality that you can provide, which is the accepting, unconditional relationship. Well, people who have disturbance or non-optimal functionality of the midfrontal cortex will have trouble with attuned communication. They have trouble getting the other person and speaking to them in a way that can be heard and listening to them in a way so that the other person can be received. So clearly there's a brain problem here. And that's what the disease model is based on. The disease model is also based on the fact that you can show that the more people use drugs, the more their brains will actually change for the worse. Like with any disease, you're going to get deterioration. So in multiple sclerosis, there's a continued deterioration of the nervous system. In the disease model of addiction, you have continued deterioration of the brain in relationship to the duration and quantity of drug use. That's true. But that doesn't make it a disease. It just means that the more you use drugs, the more damage they will cause. So the disease model assumes that this is the effect of the drugs. It doesn't explain why people who don't use drugs may have the same problems. And it also doesn't explain why people get that way. And of course, it also doesn't explain why people who don't use drugs get entrenched in their behaviors. So let's just look at a little bit about the, oh yeah, and I was saying, yes, I know I was talking about the disease definition of addiction, which shows abnormality in these important brain circuits, like impulse regulation, stress regulation, incentive and motivation. Those are the main ones that they look at, and they find abnormalities in these brains. It's got to be a brain disease. Now, impulse regulation is also a major feature of ADHD. That's one of the criteria. So there's something that addictions and ADHD have in common, which makes ADHD a high risk for addictions. So they both diagnoses are characterized by lack of impulse regulation on the part of the individual, which simply means if I have an impulse to act or to say or to act out, I will do it, even if it's inappropriate, because the part of my brain that is supposed to regulate the impulses is just not functioning properly. And the job of the cortex, the gray matter, is not so much to initiate actions, by the way, but to regulate the impulses, to inhibit impulses. So the cortex does more inhibition than it does initiation. Because the impulses are arising from the lower brain centers, and there's got to be some executive functioning up here that says, yes, this is appropriate right now. No, that is not appropriate right now. And if you do drug scans on, brain scans on drug addicts, I was going to say drug scans on brain addicts, but I actually mean, I've been talking too much the last 2 days. I actually mean brain scans on drug addicts. A common finding is abnormality in the part of the brain that contributes to impulse regulation right here. Let's just look at the addicted brain then. And then let's ask the question, if it's not a disease, then how did it get that way? So I mentioned the impulse regulation circuits, and I mentioned the incentive motivation circuits. Let's look at the incentive motivation circuits. As I mentioned earlier, this runs on dopamine. So dopamine is the brain chemical that greases the wheels of the incentive motivation apparatus. And so in drug addicts, the cocaine addicts and stimulant addicts are literally looking for elevated dopamine levels that the stimulants provide. But even opiate addicts are looking for elevated dopamine levels because even before they use the drug, just the very thinking about it will get their incentive motivation circuits going. It gives them a high even before they use. And this is what's wrong with the disease model. The same thing is true for all the behavior addictions. So whether it's gambling, or sex, or shopping, or pornography, these all elevate dopamine levels. It's the same circuits that are involved in drug addiction. Well, in that's the case, what happens to the theory that it's the drugs that cause the addiction? And so, again, if you were here yesterday, leave yourself out of this inquiry for the moment. Let me ask you guys a question, those of you that were not here yesterday. Is alcohol addictive, yes or no? What's the answer? Sorry? Yes, the answer is yes. Is that right? If alcohol is addictive, let me ask you all a question. How many of you have ever had a drink in your life? Any alcoholic drink? Ever? Just raise your hand. If you ever had a glass of wine, beer, whatever, whiskey. How many of you have never had a drinking problem? Raise your hand. Okay. So at least half here. Well, if alcohol was addictive, you should all have been alcoholics. So, I'm going to ask you again. Is alcohol addictive, yes or no? The answer is yes or no, depending on the individual. The same thing. How many of, stupid question, but raise your hand, indulge me. How many of you have ever eaten anything in your life? Just raise your hand, okay? Okay. And how many would recognize that you've had an eating problem, an eating addiction? Just raise your hand. Okay? So much fewer number, okay? So if food was addictive in itself, so what's the question? What's the answer? Is food addictive, yes or no? The answer is yes or no. Is shopping addictive? Yes or no. Is cocaine addictive? Yes or no. Is pornography addictive? Yes or no. Is sex addictive? The answer is yes or no. What we're looking at is what conditions create the susceptibility. Why are some people vulnerable to certain drugs or certain behaviors and others are not? Because ultimately, when we're talking about the incentive motivation circuitry, all addicts of whatever type and whatever behavior, whatever substance, are addicted to elevated dopamine levels. So the shopping addict is not addicted to what they're shopping for. They're addicted to that dopamine high, that elevation of incentive, motivation, and vitality, that excitement when they're shopping. And that was the case in my situation, where no amount of acquiring what I was shopping for ever abated the addiction. Because it wasn't about what I was looking for. It was about the process of looking. That's what I was addicted to. And no sooner did I buy a few $100s worth of compact discs, then I'd have to return to the store even the same day or possibly the next day, even sometimes leaving work, certainly ignoring my family and so on, to run back to the store because I wanted that dopamine high. I thought I wanted that next record or that next CD and I needed it, and once I had it, I'd be complete. But of course, you're never complete because you're not after what you're looking for, you're after the looking, the seeking, that dopamine high, because dopamine flows in states of high incentive and motivation. So dopamine flows when you're exploring a novel object, a novel environment. We have a brain system for seeking. We have to survive, and without seeking and exploration, there's no survival. So this is an important brain circuit. What I'm really saying about addiction is that it represents the inappropriate activations of essential brain circuits without which life is impossible. That's why addictions are so powerful. So dopamine flows when you're seeking food, when you're seeking a sexual partner. So the sex addict is not really addicted to sex, they're addicted to the seeking. Because if they were addicted to sex, they wouldn't have to have multiple partners. They just have one partner that they can have sex with, somebody who's into the same thing. But it's really about the seeking that they're addicted to. They're also addicted to having to prove to themselves that they're desirable over and over and over and over again. as a matter of fact, once somebody desires you enough, they're not even interesting to you anymore. So that's what's involved in all addictions. In the case of, again, stimulant addictions, they specifically elevate dopamine levels. But all behaviors of addiction trigger the release of dopamine, which means to say that all addicts, all addicted people, doesn't matter whether it's substance or not, are addicted to a substance, and that substance is their own dopamine. It's just that they've learned that only through that particular behavior will they get enough of a dopamine hit. So the more you gamble and the more dopamine you get, the more you're going to want to gamble again. And this is where the learning comes into it. But the gambler is not after the money. If they were, then if they had a big win, they would just stay away for the rest of their lives. But they don't. They go back the next day or the next morning, same day even, and they lose everything they gained. Because it's after the seeking, the excitement, that they're compelled to pursue. So that's the dopamine apparatus. That doesn't function in addicts. Then we can look at the opiate addiction, or the opiate circuitry. So the opiates are powerful pain relievers. We know that. We've been using them in medicine for thousands of years. And they function because we have an internal system that is also based on opiates, and that's the endorphin system. Endorphin simply means endogenous or internal morphine-like substance. And the reason that the opiate molecules fits on our cells, on the receptors on our cells, is because we have internal opiates that sufficiently resemble the opium-derived products that the brain and the cells can't tell the difference. So that we have opiate receptors because we have our own opiate system, and the external opiates then come and fit into that system, into those receptors. Why do we have an internal endorphin system, an endogenous morphine-like system? Well, their functions are also essential for life, just like the dopamine circuitry. The first function of the opiates is pain relief, and you can all understand why pain relief is important to us. And pain relief, in this case, I don't just mean physical pain relief, I also mean emotional pain relief. So the opiates soothe emotional pain as well as physical pain. That's their first function. Their second function being what was mentioned here in the front about euphoria and pleasure. The opiates give us a sense of euphoria, pleasure, and reward. Now again, without that, life is rather miserable. So no wonder we want it. And we have a natural circuitry that modulates and mediates pleasure and reward and joy. And that's the opiate circuitry. So that's their second function. And their third function, I've been talking about the whole day, attachment. They help to facilitate attachment. So in laboratory animals, if they have no endorphin receptors, because genetically you've knocked them out, knocked out the genetic, these are called knockout mice, where you knock out some function in their brains. In this case, you knocked out their opiate receptors, endorphin receptors, and without endorphin receptors, these little mice on separation from mother will not ask for help, which, as you understand, in the wild would mean their immediate demise. The demise of the mice, I just made that up. Okay, so the opiate receptors and the opiate functioning is essential for connection, for attachment. It's part of what has been called the love cocktail. And without endorphin activity, there's no connection between the infant and the parent. In other words, there's no life for the infant. So that's how important they are. So numerous times when I asked people why they use heroin, opiates, I got answers like, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. Or another time, this guy in detox told me that, Doc, I don't know how to tell you this, but opiates are like, or the heroin is like when you're 3 years old and you're sick and you're shivering with a fever, and your mother puts you on her lap and wraps you in a warm blanket and gives you warm chicken soup That's what the heroin feels like. And they're talking about attachment. Now just take those two circuits, the incentive motivation apparatus, without which there's no excitement, no vitality, no seeking, no liveliness, and take the endorphin circuits. Without their proper functioning, there's no pain relief, emotional pain relief. There's no pleasure and reward, no elation, no joy, and no connection, no contact, no love. And let's say somebody, for some reason, finds that without a particular substance or without a particular behavior, they're not going to have those qualities in their lives. Is it really going to work to put a sign on the wall that says, just say no? Just say no to love, say no to incentive and motivation, say no to pain relief, say no to all that. And this is the inexorable and compelling drive that urges people into addictions. And that's why they have such a hard time giving up. Now, of course, there's another technical reason why drugs particularly are hard to give up, because some drugs, certainly cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, the opiates, crystal meth, and so on, if you give it up suddenly, you go through unbearable withdrawal. And that's a really unpleasant state to be in. So addicts sometimes stay addicted just to avoid withdrawal. But that's not the main reason, because we can usually manage people's withdrawal medically. It's not such a problem to manage somebody's withdrawal. So unpleasant as withdrawal is, that's not the reason people stay addicted. And that's certainly not the reason why they go back to being addicted. It really has to do with the functions of these brain circuits, and for some reason, these circuits, along with impulse regulation and stress regulation, just don't work. So when these people are stressed, they're going to use. And when they have an impulse to use, there's nothing up here to stop it. And that's why somebody once very astutely wrote that the problem in addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free want. So there's nothing to say no with. And the question is, why not? Thank you. Thank you.